president of the, all right, thank you. Anyway, this is a situation of, ooh, you got to get rid of this picture in front of me here. Got it. All right. Anyway, I want to start off by talking about the fact that I generally in every January, I interview the year before, and that would be 1920, or this is 1921 rather. What went on globally as a result of World War I, an effect that it had, and as you know, it is continually affecting us to this very day. So I want to start off by quoting our last speaker in December, Professor Armstead, who quoted Churchill by saying, the great wars, the great countries that fought in World War I, their war is over, but the pygmy wars have begun. And he meant that by that, he meant the smaller nations. And I want to talk about four of them. Other people may not think of them as small, and I want to be challenged on this number of items, but I did quite a bit of research and I'm not complete. There's even more and more information I'm finding out. But the four wars I want to talk about are the Russo-Polish Wars, or the Russo or the Soviet-Polish Wars is often titled, the Greco-Turkish War, ironically, the Irish-British War, and the Russian Civil War. Now, those wars were, in fact, happened almost immediately right after World War I. And I'll start off with the Polish War, Russian War, is that when they decided at Versailles the borders between the Soviet Union then and Poland, they were not happy with either one of them, of the countries. In fact, Lenin annulled the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and he moved the border west. Well, the Polish chief of state at that time, Joseph Pilsudski, and if Melanie would bring up his picture, I'd like to everybody see it, moved the troops east. While Russia was still in the throes of a civil war, the Polish troops moved into the Ukraine, and as the Soviet Union got stronger with its military civil war, they moved into the Ukraine, and they forced the Ukrainians to join the Poles and in fighting them. And the Soviet Union's counterattacked, and they, especially the north and the south of the Ukraine, and they pushed the Poles to the Warsaw border. And desperately, Pilsudski asked for help. And the only one who responded were the French. And they sent General Maxime Weygand, who became, as you will know, the man who eventually surrendered to the Germans in 1940, came to assist them. And they pushed the Soviets back. And then finally, the Soviets, under Lenin's pressure, because the Civil War was eating out the Russians completely, they came to an agreement. Now, the border between the Russians and the Poles was 200 kilometers from what was then known as the Curzon Line, which was the one decided at Versailles. And Pilsudski refused to accept this. And so there's been a lot of irritation and stiff competition between the Poles and the Russians. And this is an unhappy situation. Even to this day, there's always been an issue with the border between Russia and Poland. All right, but it was all, he was forced to accept it due to Western pressure. Now, this is only one of many wars in Eastern Europe. There were wars between the Estonians and the Finns, between the Latvians and Lithuanians, all for a war of independence. The Ukrainians wanted independence, but the Polish and Soviet war was the longest. It lasted longer. All right. Now, the Soviet attempted expansion included the Hungarian and Bavarian Soviet republics. They were short-lived, and they did not last long enough for them. But the Polish-Czechoslovakian border became a conflict. There was no settlement in land. In fact, when they talk about the map of the Balkans, they can throw in the whole of the northern nor the Balkans as well, because there is always this problem. Then there was a war between the Turks and the Greeks, and the Greeks in their anxiety wanted to expand and control most of what I would say, the Turkish peninsula. They invaded a considerable amount of Turkey. They got as far almost as to the midpoint of the Black Sea. They ran into the oppositions of the British and the French and the Italians who were there as well, and the French. But as you know, the great leader of the Turks, Mustafa Kemal, came forward and rallied the Turks against the Greeks, pushing them all the way back to their area there. Now you see that yellow part there is where they got into Turkey at that time. And so it was a war that was bitter because there were a lot of minorities in there, particularly among Armenians, Jews, and Greeks. And they were all trying to find themselves, at least to survive this war that came out with no rules and no real government. But nevertheless, the Turks survived and unified their country under their leader. All right, I'm moving now to one other country. This is Germany. You wonder why I would take Germany. Germany was still the dominant nation in Central Europe at this time. It was reeling from its defeat and the Versailles Treaty and its demands. And it was still in shock from its displaced government and its newly formed Weimar Republic. The Reichstag became the scene of conflict. There were socialists arguing with right-wing elements. There was the Freikorps, still very active in Germany, leading troops, but there was a high unemployment. Soldiers came back unable to find work. The economic situation in Germany became desperate, and it reached a climax when the French insisted on payment for the amount that was given to them. And I don't know whether you know it, but they were given a price to pay
the World War I thing.
$33 billion. Now that's $1920 that they had to face and pay. They want to be paid in installments. And the Germans were caught. They didn't have the money there, so they insisted on it. Yet they were forcing them, they had to pay on the 1st of May, part of that money. And they finally came up with an amount. If they didn't pay, all right, they had to pay 4 million gold marks to the French and British and especially the Belgians. And I might add this, that there's a looks money. This happens in 1923, this picture of the amount of money that happened. That was a slow process by which the mark lost value, and it reached its peak when it has something like 14 million marks to a dollar. Now, money just blew in the streets when it was there because it just became valueless. All right, so this took some, movement on part of the Germans to settle this situation. I'll talk about that whenever I give a talk about 1923. But anyway, the French and British told the Germans, unless you pay, we'll occupy 3 of your major cities. And that forced the Germans to come forward. Now, there were 1 million men unemployed in this country. And yet, if Germany was to pay for this $33 billion, it had to become industrialized, it had to export, but nobody was buying anything. And Germany was not having much luck. Surprisingly enough, the Weimar Republic sustained itself. It came into existence and lasted until 1933. Reparations were the real cross which the country had to face. The French above all insisted on payment, and that caused the Germans a considerable amount of upset because their troops were right on their border. And they threatened to occupy another part of the border between Germany and France remember, was now extended to include Alsace-Lorraine. And the French moved all their troops in that area to protect their new acquired or their old acquired provinces of France. Furthermore, the man who signed the, shall we say, the ceasefire and the, I'm sorry if I'm getting lost in terms here, in, you said the armistice, Matthias Erzberger, and I wish Melanie would bring up his picture, was one of the men who signed and approved the Weimar Republic coming into existence. And he was coming out of a 1921. He was came out of a resort, and he was assassinated because he signed that armistice in retaliation to him. I might add this, that the former finance minister he signed that ceasefire, and when he got back to Germany, he had to be protected because they knew there were people who would oppose his role in that position, and he was executed. All right. Now, I might say this, and I'll come to that when I cover the part about America, but nevertheless, technically, we were still at war with Germany. I don't know whether many people know this, but until 1921, we were still at war. Obviously, there was no killing and no deaths involved, but we were technically at war with Germany. And until 1921, then finally a peace treaty was signed. I'll talk about that later and everything else. But I'd like to move now to another war, if I can, and there's a lot more information on this one. It's the British-Irish War, all right, in 1921. I don't know whether you knew this, but right after World War I, Britain experienced a short but very active boom in their economy. From 1918 till about halfway through the end of the year of 1919, there was a boom in England, but it only lasted a very short time. By 1921, there were 1 million unemployed in England, and the economy was not recovering as fast as they thought. It was actually slowed down. But there's nothing I can say except the fact that Britain never looked greater in 1920 and 21 than after World War I. She had acquired an enormous amount of land from the other parts of the empire, particularly from the Ottoman Empire, but she actually bit off more than she could chew. It's very expensive to run an empire. It's not always profitable to get an empire going full blast, but here it was. She had to support her vast empire and acquire these new lands and pay for it, at least do something with it. But it was too costly for her, and it was very difficult to rule. The war weakened the hold of the empire, especially of them, not just the British, but the English, the French as well, and the other countries as well. But its critical issue was Ireland. Remember that prior to World War I, there was a movement to increase Irish home rule, not freedom, not independence, but increasing home rule. Now the issue came up. They wanted freedom. They wanted to be an independent country. And it broke out after in the Easter Rising in 1916. There was Irish demands for more and more independence. The U.S. Entry incidentally saved Lloyd George from in drafting the Irish in World War I. America came in, and the Irish, he withdrew his determination to include the Irish in their drafting. But there was struggle with Northern Ireland, which insisted on staying with Britain. And finally, in 1922, Ireland was granted independence, but it was called Irish Free State. It didn't become an independent full country until 1936, when it insisted on being there as an independent country. And now, as you know, it's called the United Kingdom of England, includes Northern Ireland as well. So I might add this: Britain is the only country that won World War I that lost land. It lost Ireland. So it has sense, you can say it didn't win everything. It lost one of its old parts, and that was the Irish landmass. Incidentally, one of the men that went to fight the Irish there, you might have remember him. It's quite interesting to know it. It was Sir John French, the man who led the first BEF in 1914. And he was sent to Ireland to quell the Irish, and his name is not revered in the Irish, among the Irish people. All right, but there were problems elsewhere that the British had to face, and that was in India. And I wanted to talk about that. I don't know whether you know this, but 142,039 Irish Indians died for Britain in World War I. That's no small number. And there was a considerable amount of debt that was owed to the Indians by the British. India was an uncomfortable ally for the British in a sense. However, it is still considered the jewel of the crown. I don't know whether you saw the program the other night on PBS, but they had a program about Churchill and his view about India in World War I. India was his blind spot. He couldn't see India independent. He said there's no way the Indians can rule themselves. And if you saw what he said in this program, for him, he would be willing to give up the rest of the entire empire, but keep India. All right. So, but there was always agitation for liberty and the end of colonial rule. And of course, Gandhi comes forward as one of the greatest leaders for Indian independence. Part of this was due, in many sense, to the Armistar Massacre in April of 1919. And I think Stephanie will, or rather Melanie, can show a picture of the fort where that occurred. And the picture was taken by Graham Beards. You have that picture there, Melanie. I think it's worth bringing up. You can. There is part of the fort. And actually, it was a very peaceful meeting of Indians who got there. They went there to gathering of Sikh for a Sikh festival, in which over 369 of them were killed, over 1,000 were wounded, and this became a massacre. And the general who ordered that was a man named General Dyer. He died in 1927, but he never excused himself. I want to bring this up because there was an incident. This incident was spread all over India. Every part of India heard about this massacre. So it is the push, and that's largely due to one man. That was, what's his name? Excuse me, I don't get his name because you all know it. It's, oh, for heaven's sakes. It's the man who made Lowell Thomas, the man who made Lawrence of Arabia famous in America. He spread that information all over India. He had access to ability to press, spread it out. And so almost every Indian heard about this massacre. It was to leave an enormous scar on the relationship between Britain and this colony of his. Anyway, that was one of the incidents I want to bring up because that accelerated the movement in India for independence. I want to move now on to someone else, some other country. In 1921, what happened in France? Well, France, of course, was one of the victims of World War I and one of the victors as well. France was reeling from the war. It had enormous amount of problems to reconstruct the areas where the war-torn areas. It lost over 1,500,000 men in World War I. Its population dropped from 38 million in 1914 to 37 million. even though it acquired Alsace-Lorraine and that population there, it still lost people. There was troubles in his government. You had Aristide Briand, who finally took over the government of France through many of its governments. You want to bring a picture of him, Melanie, it would be great. And he was the one who finally formed a solid cabinet, Aristide Briand, well known to Americans as well. I might add this, France stood in high prestige at this time in history. France was very well respected as one of the great countries of Europe. Her population, though, had dropped, as I said, and there were so many other difficulties. There were strikes that hit France. France found itself deep in debt, as Great Britain did as well. Remember, Great Britain was the banker for the first parts of World War I, and then she had to turn to America for loans. Now, the whole of Europe was really in debt to America. All right, now, she had both problems domestically and foreign. She had a revolt in Morocco, which she put down brutally to keep her under her control. She was unable and unwilling to extend loans to people. And she went on to lower wages and to increase taxes. And this finally brought the French government to a halt. It could not go any further. So they finally got rid of those. Furthermore, they found out that the Soviet government refused to pay the loans that France had given Russia prior to World War I and during World War I, especially in the railroad buildings in Russia. Lenin insisted they won't pay them, and they never did. So France lost out there. So anyway, this is France's uncomfortable position it was in World War I. Okay, I'd like to move way across from there to Japan. Now, why Japan? Well, Japan was one of the winners of World War I, acquiring all the empire. It expanded. It took over the German islands in the Pacific, Marianas, all those, and the Shantung Peninsula on the Chinese mainland, giving Japan a hold on the Chinese nation. She was also she had already taken control of Korea. She was in Vladivostok, but Versailles had granted Japan effective control of the northeastern Pacific and a greater interest in North Asia. All right, now, I want to bring this out because it made Japan broader in its concern and control. It was become the greater Japanese control of all of that part of the world. There was an emperor in Japan at that time, Emperor Taishiko, I never could say his name right, but he was too sick to rule. He was mentally incompetent, and he wanted his son, who became Hirohito, and to become emperor of Japan, but he didn't become full emperor until 1927, until the emperor died, the old emperor died. Let me go on and say something about this, because Japan was still considered a very strong military man, but it never sent much of its army anywhere, but it did send its navy. And it became aware that there was a new movement in the Navy in developing of different types of ships, particularly now that the British had developed the first aircraft carrier. So they sent a delegation to England, asking them to give them information about preparing and creating a new ship. They wanted information about building it. The British refused. Furthermore, the British were given pressure by the Americans to break off its long alliance with Japan. It had made an alliance with Japan, which is why it joined the Allies in World War I. And the Britain effectively broke off this alliance with Japan. I did agree, though, to a four-party that recognized the status quo in the Pacific. I'll come to that part later on. The other issue is that the prime minister who opposed this movement of the Japanese Navy and wanted to maintain the alliance with Britain was assassinated. And that's the man whose name I could hardly pronounce. But anyway, his name is Haratashaki.
Sorry, Sal, did you want me to show Takashi Hara?
Yes, please show him. He was killed at a train station. Can you show his picture, please? Have you got it, Melanie? There. He was the prime minister. Now, he's the first prime minister to be assassinated in Japan. There was one who was assassinated in the 1930s as well. And I might add that this was the time when the American ambassador, Andrew Grew, came into Japan and became one of the great ambassadors at the time at 1940 and when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Anyway, Japan had its own problems internally. There was a rice riot in Japan, and it was handled by women. It was due to inflation and low wages. So it wasn't always a happy situation in Japan at this time. Nevertheless, it was a increasing greater power in the Pacific, which brings me to the next place I want to talk about, and that is China. China in 1921 was going through a great deal of struggle. The Chinese Communist Party was formed in this time. It was officially established. But the real party that ran China supposedly was the Kuomintang, run by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, well known throughout the world and honored to this day by both the non-communists and the communists in China. Anyway, he allowed that party to exist. But by the Versailles Treaty caused a wave of bitter resentment in China, because when they ceded the Shantung Peninsula to the Japanese, the Chinese felt that they were lost a great portion of their country. And to this day, they have never forgiven the Versailles Treaty and the Allies for giving that land to them. There were riots all over the major cities in Beijing, Nanking, and even in Hong Kong. On the 4th of May, there was riots in which a number of people were killed, but it catalyzed the political movement in China, which had long been considered as almost inert and dormant. But it brought out a greatness. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, that's his picture there. And he had traveled around the world, spoke fluent English, and he was a latecomer in this. But he tried, with some influence, to get China involved in World War I, but not enough to make any impression on them. But China itself was in intense difficulty. There were droughts, there was floods, it was plagued by famines, especially in northern China, flooding. There was lacked food supplies. Areas large and small were ruled by warlords. So there was no real central government that could govern the whole country, leading a very ineffective central government. But at that same year, in 1921, the Whampoa Military Academy was established with Chiang Kai-shek as its first leader. But the military academy was funded by the Soviet Union. So it was a tremendous influence that to this day, they owe that to Lenin for establishing that military position there in China. Dr. Sun Yat-sen left 3 principles he wanted for the Chinese. He wanted, 1, nationalism, that is the self-determination for the Chinese people, including minorities. I don't know whether you know that, but China has 26 minorities in its boundaries. 2, he wanted democracy. That is the right to control their own government, their own institutions with referendums, recall. He wanted those. And then he believed in socialism, it's a vague term for that, in which he wanted what do you call a specialization and equalization of land distribution, just taxations, and also to develop industrially. All this was to come about, of course, much, much later in the 20th century. But anyway, that's where you get it. Very interesting man with all those medals there. And that's a young Chiang Kai-shek, I take it. Anyway, I certainly have the Chiang Kai-shek and the Sung family. I have a personal experience with some of this, and I'm bringing this out. In 1944, I'm a little boy, I'm only 8 years old. I was taken to San Francisco by my aunt, and who should arrive in San Francisco but Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And she spoke publicly, and we were there. I'm a little kid, I'm watching her, and I thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world. And nevertheless, I just needed to have to say that, because that's my connection with her. Now, the Sung family, which is her name, have property here in Berkeley, and it's only 6 blocks from where I live right now. So there's our connection with that. All right, there's another country I'd like to talk about, and that is Mexico. Why Mexico? Well, it's on our border. And I want to talk about the Revolution Mexicana. It's the Mexican Revolution. Mexico was an unstable place. It had revolted against Porfirio Diaz of Mexico, because he had ruled Mexico from 1876 to 1910, when it finally exploded, and with the what they call a federal army was transforming the Mexican culture, and they overthrew the federal army, and they were extremely cruel to them. To this, as that's Porfirio Diaz. He was eventually thrown out and forced to leave Mexico. And they tried to form a new constitution, but they wound up being in civil war. One of the hardest things in Mexico in its history is land distribution. And remember that there is, in Mexico, 2 divisions racially. There are what they call the mestizos, which are the product of the European and original Mexican Indian population, and what they call the Europeans, are often called the peninsulares, meaning of the Spanish peninsula, of them, who are the European element there. Furthermore, there was population from immigration in Mexico. And if you've ever been to the city of Monterrey in Mexico, it's very German. And remember, the Germans introduced beer in Mexico, and as well. And of course, it experienced its occupation by the French and the occupation under the Maximilian. But that was, of course, overthrown. But there is nevertheless a desire in Mexico to form a national government that made sense, but it took many years. Furthermore, Mexico was involved in World War I. If you all remember that the famous Zimmerman note was sent to Mexico for them to attack us, and they would be granted land back that they had lost in the American-Mexican War there. And of course, wisely, they chose not to be involved in it, but that flamed America into World War I. Well, they finally settled to a much stronger central government, and they had a number of people that were involved. One of them was a man named Carranza, who finally got it together. And it was influenced largely by Americans as well. One of the things they passed in Mexico, I think some of you should know, although I believe it's changed now, I haven't realized it to this day, but one of the things I wanted to know is that they passed a law that 51% of all land and industry in Mexico must be owned and controlled by Mexicans. Is to give them the final word. They had been exploited by many, many countries. Now, a number of countries had invested in Mexico, particularly when they found oil there and gasoline. That did an awful lot to put Mexico on the map. Excuse me a moment. All right. They formed a revolutionary party called the PNR, which is the Partido Nacional Revolucionario. Now, I've been to Mexico many times, and it's a great place to visit, but it is still shaky in keeping complete control over that country. In many ways, it's been a worse place for killings between mobs and the drug program. All right, now, I should say this too, and I don't know whether you do it, but when I study this part about Mexico and eventually Latin America as well, is Latin American countries judge the United States how we treat Mexico. In other words, our relationship. We have had very positive, good relationships in the last 40 years. And I think this is largely due to many far-thinking people in both countries and doing this. Now, but many Europeans have invested in Latin America as well. And they have opened their borders. They're much more open in receiving immigration than we are. And many, many countries have done that, which brings me now to the part I want to talk about, which is what happened here in America in 1921. Well, on March 4th, 1921, we had a new president, and that was Harding, and his vice president, which was always interesting to see happen in our country, was, good heavens, have I forgotten his name wrong already? Anyway, that's, who was his vice president? Eventually became president. Somebody help me on that.
Coolidge.
Coolidge, that's right. There's Harding there, the man who looked like a president, as is often quoted the point. And let's see on the next vice president, please. Can you see that?
Just give me 1 second, sorry. Oops.
Calvin Coolidge is our boy. Let's see what he can do for us. Well, let me go on to one more point that I want to say. The population of the United States in the 1920 census was 106,021,537 people. That was a 15% increase in over 1910. We gained 15% more. And the other irony of it is, and this is what I found most interesting, is that the next year in 2021, let's see here, where do I have that? That here somewhere. Oh, I had it here a while ago. Anyway, we gained another million in that time. Now, I want to bring up the other point is one of the things that Harding did, which I thought was most intriguing, is that he ended the war with Germany. And by doing that, he signed the treaty in Berlin, in Vienna, and in Hungary, is that we had gone to war with all the Central Powers at that time. And I might add a few other things that might be part of it. Excuse me, man, I'm looking for a paper here that I'm missing. Let me do a little bit of research here first. Oh, yeah. There was a movement because of this. You might be interested to know this, that there was a movement to control immigration. In 1920, over 357,803 immigrants came into the United States. And this caused a reaction in America. There was a reaction that they thought, quote, we're losing our American point of view. And it was aimed at Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and the Jewish communities therein. Furthermore, we had just gone through the whole of a Red Scare at that time. And we thought that the Bolshevik influence was getting stronger. Every strike, whether it be in the steel mills, in coal, in all the areas of industries, were deemed to be influenced by the Bolshevik or the Red Scare. Now, some of you may not know this, but we had two Red Scares in America. One in 1920 and 21, and then 1947 to 1953. Those are the McCarthy period of our history. Now, they created in May of May 19th, an emergency quota act passed both houses, which was to limit the number of people coming into America. And they came up with the 3% current nationality list. Now, it didn't become full law until 1924 in the McCarran Act, but it was based on the idea of limiting America to its original nationalities that were here. So it was open to other countries, particularly Northern Europe, but not to Southern Europe or Eastern Europe. And that was called the Johnson Act in 1921. I was always curious about this. It was open to Latin America. It was open doors to that, but not to Europe and not to Asia. They put a firm stop to that one. So the limits on immigration. Now, if you know anything, even currently, there's a big issue in our current legislation about immigration, and it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. All right. Now, there were race issues in America at this time. And one of the worst was the example that happened in the United States in this area called the Tulsa Race Massacre on June 21st. I don't know how to explain this to you because I never knew anything about it until I started reading about it. What happened? There was a area of the city that was Black. Remember, they were segregated pretty effectively in those days, in which had become rather prosperous. And it was a Black area. They called it Black Wall Street. And it started by a strange incident, and I think it's worth explaining. It's a young man got into an elevator where a white woman was in charge, and he stepped on her foot by mistake. And he apologized. He just told her where he was going to go. And she accused him of violating her. Well, he didn't pay much attention. He went up to where he had to go, came back down. There was a group of white men waiting for him. They dragged him to a police station. Well, this alarmed the Black community. And they sent a group of armed men, Black men, to the police station, demanding the release of this man, or better yet, just to protect him from being lynched. Well, one of the white people in that area saw a Black person with a gun, said, I want you to surrender that gun now. Well, he said he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't abandon his gun. Well, that caused a bit of difficulty, and some of the whites came out, and they started demanding it. Release. Guns went off. Within a very short time, 36 people were dead, in which 26 were Blacks, 13 were white. They went into the village, this area called the Black Wall Street, set fire to buildings, destroyed all their commerce. Excuse me, I can't answer that. The amazing fact that they had no opportunity to save themselves. The entire area was wiped out. And I don't know how to explain it to you. There it is, a picture of it. That's what's left of it. And it's just now in 1921, excuse me, in 2021, they've acknowledged this. And it was kept even from the rest of the country, this information about what happened here. Now, there were race riots everywhere, all over Asia. Over America. There was in Chicago. There was in Washington, D.C. Everyone. He did, you see, Hockenberry did a piece on this before. But to me, this is one of the worst possible examples of our race relations in America. Furthermore, and you might as well know this, in 1921, there were over 64 lynchings in America. You might not know this, but whites were lynched. 5 whites were lynched, but 59 blacks were, lynched in America. It's not the happiest picture of our country. Now, let me go on with this a little bit further. In November 11th, and this is one thing I wanted everybody to see, there was the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Now, this is 100 years. And I read recently from the military magazine that there's going to be a ceremony, 100 years ceremony on November 11th this year in honor of the unknown soldier. Now, there are many changes that are happening in our country. For one thing, in the 1920 census proved the point that America no longer was a rural, agricultural, populated country. It is now becoming more urban populated, and it's been ever since. I think less than 2% of our population is engaged in agriculture in our country today. So that started at that time. Furthermore, the automobile was making its presence known. Roads were being improved. Our population was growing all the time. Schools were opened everywhere. Banks opened in many places. It's always good to know that our country was growing at this time. And even though for 2 years, right after World War I, 1918, 1919, there was actually a slow recession in America, but it didn't last very long. The automobile was replacing the horse. Road systems were growing. Quote, normalcy was returning to America. We were becoming rich. And we had become rich, better yet. And it appeared that our economy was booming, especially in the urban areas. The stock market became the symbol of the economic progress. New banks, I said, were all opening. Radio has been coming in. More and more people were listening now. It was becoming another form of, of communications. So America has changed from its pre-World War I basis to now one of the richest countries in the world, if not the richest country, and stayed that way for most of that century. All of this occurred up until 1929. Now that's about as far as I got in this. Now, would anybody like to make some comments to me? Anybody got any questions? Come on, James.
I got one.
What? Who?
So on the reparations payments that Germany had to pay, they had to pay in gold, right?
Yes, they did. Yes, they
And
did.
how much gold did they have?
Well, they had gold. It is interesting because I was reading more about this, about how much they had to pay. They thought if they had won the war, they were going to extract gold from all their other countries that they defeated. Now, they had gold, but not enough. And they had gold was the standard at that time. Britain had, which was then the economic power prior to World War I, had set the gold standard for all economies and all bases of money, except Japan. Japan based its wealth on silver. It depended its money on silver. And that program about Churchill, the British stayed to the gold standard because he insisted on it until 1927, when they had to redo it all over. In the meantime, the English pound, and I want to say this compared to the German mark, the British pound was considered the real ironclad money of the world at that time. But because it had paid out so much in support of the war, for other countries, including France and Italy and Russia, and it turned to the United States. So we wound up being the financier of the war for the Allies. But in Germany, they only had their only gold supply that they had, and they were running out. So that's when they printed money, because they couldn't come up with the gold, but they could pay the first 3 payments in gold. And that was $3 billion in gold first. They never got beyond that. I might add this, in one of my studies of World War I at Versailles, the Germans themselves came up with what they thought they owed. They accepted defeat, all right? But they came up with about $12 billion. And that's really all they ever paid. You remember when Hitler took over, throughout the 20s, the Germans kept saying they shouldn't pay this amount of money. Finally, they said they couldn't pay that amount of money. When Hitler took over, he said they wouldn't pay it any, and nobody could force them. And that is the situation. The limit of German gold finally exhausted the German economy. And that's when they printed those tons of money that take for $1. The dollar now became increasingly the money standard for the world, and did to the present day. Any more questions?
Hi, Sal.
Yeah.
Yeah, couple of clarifications, actually. When you were talking about India and the Amritsar massacre,
Yes.
the place where the massacre took place wasn't a fort; it was a walled, enclosed garden.
Yes, it was. I'm sorry, you're right.
Means, means is fortified and stuff like that. The people that assembled there had no idea at all of fortifying the place. And General Dyer basically, I mean, the whole protest was in view of the British suspension of civil rights in India.
Yes.
That there was it was supposed to end at the end of the First World War, but a judge called Judge Rowlatt extended it.
Yes, he did.
Because the British were always afraid that Indians were going to mutiny and stuff like that. I mean, just like McCarthy saw a red under every bed, the Brits saw a mutiny under every bed in India.
Yeah.
And basically, they overreacted. Secondly, when you were talking about Japan, a couple of things. During the First World War in 1915, the Japanese levied. They were already eyeing China as a possible place where they're going to build an empire. And so they leveled this thing called the 21 demands.
Yes, they did.
The Chinese government. And there was a bit of kerfuffle there. And also in 1919, when the Versailles Treaty was ratified, the Japanese tried to inject a
racial thing.
Code of racial equality.
Yes.
And that was rejected. So that was a couple of reasons that Japan was sort of antagonized. And then, of course,
I might add that it was Wilson also who didn't want that in there. And
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't want that in there.
And of course, Wilson's favorite film was Birth of a Nation. So we know where he gets his democratic credentials from.
Yeah.
The other thing I was wondering about is when you were talking about the States, how was Prohibition going at this time in 1921?
Well,
introduced in
the
1920.
Prohibition, I might add, under Harding, never reached the White House.
Okay.
He managed to get his supply. And incidentally, I was always curious to know that if you really wanted to drink in Washington, you went to the French or British embassy.
Oh.
You were welcome there to have a couple of drinks because it was allowed. It was a ridiculous law to begin with, and it was hardly enforced. It was illegal to produce and sell liquor, but it was not illegal to drink it. If you understand what that meant.
Well, yeah, of course.
So you were allowed, incidentally, 200 gallons. Every person was allowed 200 gallons of beer to make at home, as long as you didn't sell it, as long as you didn't promote it, you were allowed that. And 200 gallons of wine 200 gallons of hard liquor per year. You were allowed that per person. Now, I know something about that because my grandparents, who were Italian background here in California, and wine was part of our meals. He was allowed to make 200 gallons. One drop more, you were arrested.
200 gallons per year, was it?
Yes,
Okay.
you were allowed that. Now, as I said, it was illegal to sell it and to produce it for sale, but not illegal to drink it. All right. So now you find that a very interesting position. Now, my father, who was a commercial fisherman in San Francisco Bay, was escorted by the harbor police out to beyond the 3 mile limit by the harbor police to the ships that carried the liquor and brought back and escorted by the harbor police to a little town called Sausalito here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And my father loved Prohibition. It was his coin money. He got a lot of coin money out of this. But that was common in major cities in America. It was hardly enforced. And it was a failure from the beginning. All right.
Well,
Well, Sal, this is Bruce.
Yes.
Little tidbit about Mexico. The
Yes.
first successful automatic rifle used in World War I was the Mondragon model 1908. And that was Mexican designed and Swiss manufactured.
Well, who acquired it as for use?
Oh, it was our side.
Oh, the Americans did.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. That's good to know. Yeah. James, do you have a question?
Yeah, Sal, your comment about the gold was very interesting in Germany. I'm wondering if prior to World War I, Germany got some of its gold supply out of Namibia, which it lost with the Versailles Treaty, which exacerbated the problem. Is that right?
Yeah, it didn't reach the amount that they really could guarantee, a possibility. What Germany needed was an export market to keep itself solvent economically, and they just wouldn't do this. It just couldn't be done. The whole of Europe was economically unsound in 1920 and 21. It just didn't know how to get over it. The war just drained everything out of its economy. Then you have these new nations in Eastern Europe that had developed. How are they going to come up with their money? They had to come up with a way of supporting. They all came up with individual money so that you had 12 monies to go through if you were traveling in that area. Now, I remember when I first went to Europe, every time you crossed a border, you had to translate your monies into what you said. It was a pain. This is why I like the euro, because you can go to many countries and just use whatever you have, which is another thing that's a product of two world wars.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
On the Polish and the Soviet and the Ukrainian, I wasn't quite clear on that. Did the Soviets gain territory in that?
Yes. Well, the Soviets eventually took over the Ukraine, moving in there in their civil war, but it caused an enormous famine in those things because the whole transportation system was wiped out in the Russian Civil War. And it was under, different control. The farmers just couldn't produce the food. They couldn't ship it out. Furthermore, and this is the part that I found most intriguing, is that when the Soviets took over an area, they demanded the food from the peasant farmers who retaliated. And they refused to give their food over. They cut their production in half. They held back. There was something like 11 million starvation scenes there. And it took Hoover to come forward and try to protect these people by feeding them. And this became a very active thing among the Russians. I have a note about that this was the forming on this deal that they had to protect. How would they say the starvation? Their children were dying by the thousands because they're all malnutrition. Russia was in chaos. It had to go through a starvation period twice. Once Lenin took over and finally the Russians settled down and took over finally in 1922, Lenin allowed the farmers to grow their crops, and their especially wheat in the Ukraine, and was able to settle down. But then when Stalin took over and started to, quote, Sovietize the farms by, consolidating them and taking the land away, food became rationed again. And the thing I found most intriguing, that when Stalin took over this, the starvation hit again in Russia at that time, particularly in the Ukraine, is they shipped food out. Wheat was sold out of Russia during that time when they were starving. Now, I don't understand how this country could survive this, but it did.
And that's where they got their capital for their industrialization.
Yes, they did. You got some of that from there. Yes, they did. No happy picture in all of this part in 1921, maybe, except in America.
I'm a little confused, though. The Ukrainians went back and forth with the Russians, though, didn't they?
Well, remember, Ukraine is divided between those that are, even religiously, they're divided. Western Ukraine is what they call Ukrainian Uniate with the Roman Catholic Church, and the eastern part is Orthodox. So there's a division there, but there's one language, but it was always the breadbasket for the Russians, and that's one of the reasons they wanted to keep it, even today. But I really don't know how to explain it to them, is that there's internal problems within the Ukrainian world. And that's as far as I can tell you about this. I really don't know that much about that area of the world. I haven't been there yet. I want to, but I haven't.
Sal, I have a correction to make.
Good.
I misspoke. There was Germany and Austria-Hungary that used the Mondragon.
Well, they used it.
Yes, yes.
Okay. I've never heard of that rifle. Do you have one yourself?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But like I say, it was the first successful automatic rifle. So
Yeah. I failed to bring out one thing about Germany and Russia, is that it was at the end of World War I when they were restricted to militarily and equipment and the number of military personnel. They did turn to the Russian and the Soviets, made an agreement with them to do experiments with military equipment there. And that came with the Germans paying for it in Russia. That happened at this time. But anyway, that's the 100 years ago, what happened in the world.
Who was that again? You just were saying
That they formed an agreement with the Russians to do a military experimentation on weaponry in Russia.
so the Germans and the Russians.
And there were Germans and the Russians, yes.
Uh-huh.
All this came out.
It was to circumvent the strictures of the Versailles Treaty.
As part of it's to avoid the restrictions on the Versailles Treaty on Germany.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, everyone, I thank you. Now, I want somebody for
There were
February.
German air bases established in Russia.
Yes, they
Ukraine.
were. Yes, they were.
Okay.
And secondly, I want to say this, the Japanese finally did learn how to build aircraft carriers. And as we know, that was the whole part of our picture of World War II. Yes. Any other questions? Well, thank you all.
Thanks, Al.